Good morning, and welcome everyone to the third annual conference organized by the Iranian Studies of the Arab Center. This panel will be shedding lights and focusing on Iran-China relationships. Each panelist will have 15 minutes, and hopefully, if we respect that, we'll have enough time for questions. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Jonathan Fulton. He's an associate professor of political science in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, and a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East Program and the Scowcraft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Fulton has written numerous books and over 30 journal articles, book chapters, and reports on Chinese policy toward the Middle East. Today, he will be talking about China and Iran, partners in revisionism. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Aicha. So, as with everybody, I have to thank the Arab Center and thank Mehran for the invitation. Always good to come to Doha. I find it a very interesting academic environment here, and it's always a pleasure. Before I start, I have to recommend, I brought this book with me today. Mehran's book on Iran is just absolutely fantastic. I learned so much from this, and I really highly recommend it if you're working on Iranian political issues. And another recommendation, and then I'll get to my paper. I subscribe to a podcast called the Iran Podcast, and when I opened it this morning, a new episode had just uploaded into my list, and it was talking about Iran's Look East policy. So, if you're into the podcast, I'd recommend you check that one out. So, my paper is looking at China and Iran as partners in revisionism, which is maybe kind of a provocative title. Before I get to the revisionism part, I just want to talk a little bit about Look East. I find over the conversations yesterday, there seems to be, to me, kind of a problem with definitions. I know that under Khomeini, the idea was neither East nor West, and that was talking about Cold War alignments, not the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc, but an independent path. When I hear Look East now, I'm really not sure what that means. I mean, I'm maybe very pedantic, but I think of it as geographically looking east towards Asia. But definitions yesterday seem to encompass BRICS, Latin America, Africa, basically everything that isn't what we call the West, like European Union and the Anglosphere. And I understand why that's the case. There's a lot of discussion about the global South and how we see this kind of post-Western order shaping up. But I find it's kind of a ill-defined block. I mean, we're talking about most of the world. Certainly there's some shared normative interest. I think what we see is a lot of interest and less weight for Western dominance, assumptions of liberal preferences, of political superiority. And I think that's something that you'll find is very, very popular. But beyond that narrative affinity, I don't see a lot of coherence when we talk about, this large group. No doubt we're at the early stages of an evolving process, but right now I think it's overstated. It doesn't really help our analysis, especially when we're looking at this bigger trend that's shaping international politics of great power competition. And whether or not you like great power competition, I don't think it really matters. I've spoken frequently and written frequently about how I think it's a kind of a dangerous framework, but the fact is it's what we've got, and we kind of have to navigate within this. And I think the alignment choices that this kind of forces or offers really shape how we should look at this stuff. Now, for Iran, I think, as with all the GCC countries or all the countries in the region, looking east is a very reasonable policy. There's just a lot of opportunity in doing this economically, developmentally. There's historical ties. It's a closer cultural fit. I think it's a very, very, again, it seems reasonable to see this. However, I think unlike with other countries in the region, I don't think Iran's look east is being returned from the east in the same way that I think Tehran would like, or at least not in the way that's being described in a lot of this. I think the geopolitics create a lot of limitations on what Iran can do in this space. The major Asian economies that have deep interests in the Gulf, those interests are largely economic. Whether if we're talking about India, China, Japan, South Korea, these are all have a much deeper and evolving presence in the region that we're seeing growing every single month. but they still remain mostly limited to economics. You don't see a lot of deep political or security engagement. Dr. Lee Chen-Sim, who spoke yesterday, she and I put out an edited book a few months ago called Asian Perceptions of Gulf Security, and we canvassed a bunch of contributions from people in Japan and Korea and India, Pakistan, China, including Degang, who wrote a great chapter. Just, how are these countries looking at this changing strategic landscape in the Gulf? And in most cases, those countries are still look at it in economic terms. They have their own very important or difficult, challenging, landscapes in their own regions, which limits what they're willing or able to do. So they're happy to keep coming here and make money, trade, get energy, do contracting, but not really willing to play a bigger role in security affairs or political affairs. And certainly, we don't see that much of that with Iran. When they do come, it typically is going to Gulf country, GCC countries, because they have a preference for the status quo because their interests are largely economic. So you could see just this summer, Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Modi visited the Gulf. They came to this side of the Gulf. You saw earlier in the year, the President Yoon from South Korea came to the Gulf and he signed a bunch of deals with the Emiratis. And he actually made some pretty incendiary comments about Iran, which angered Tehran quite a bit. So I think with a lot of these Asian countries or Eastern countries, they are getting more deeply engaged in the region, but it's not to Iran's benefit. I think there's limitations in what they're willing to do. I think the fact that Japan and Korea are U.S. allies and that India is aligning closer and closer with America in most meaningful ways limits what they're willing to do with Iran. Despite talk of Chabahar and other, historical connections between India and Iran, the fact is present day, they're just not doing a lot of meaningful stuff. So again, the idea, I think Iran can look as much as it wants, but I don't think it matters if the other countries don't look back. I think really the only Asian country, at least the only major economy left is the PRC, is China. And in this, I think you'll still see some of the same sorts of limitations despite, a narrative of a deeper alignment or partnership between the two. Some of those limitations, I think, again, China's interests in the Gulf, despite what we're seeing in the news, are mostly economic. I think China faces a very challenging domestic environment. It faces a very challenging environment within its own region. I don't think it really wants to play a bigger role in security affairs or political affairs in the Gulf, but I think it's very satisfied to continue trading, getting energy, getting contracts to do construction. And I think that's really, the primary driver of what China's doing in the region. If that's the case, China too has a preference for the status quo. And in that case, I think it gets a lot more of its interests served by working more closely with the GCC countries. So, despite talk of, China coming to Iran with $400 billion in a 25-year deal, which of course there's nothing quantitative in any of these agreements. This is a media-driven set of numbers. You just don't see it. You don't see China willing to do more meaningful stuff. I think the tensions between Iran and the U.S. also limit what China's willing to do. We've seen this time and again, that China offers rhetorical support for Iran, but when it gets time for a meaningful contribution, China doesn't want secondary sanctions. Their $600 billion trade with the U.S. every year is worth a whole lot more than $10 billion with Iran every year. So there's definitely limits, I think, to what China's willing to do with Iran in material terms. And we've seen, especially lately, there's a lot of stories being published about, this dramatic increase in China-Iran trade, which is true. The numbers are getting bigger. But remember, they're getting bigger from a very almost non-existent basement, right? Like the high point, I think, was 2014, when it was almost $40 billion a year in bilateral trade. A couple of years ago, it was down to, I think, just under 10. So it's not like an increase in trade really means that China's doing a whole lot more, because its trade with the Emirates, I believe, was about $75 billion last year, and with Saudi, it's even more. So the increase is real, but it also doesn't really benefit Iran that much, because what you're seeing with China is it's very advantageous, I think, for China right now, because again, with SWIFT, they're not willing to do any kind of transactions that involve trading in a traditional way. What's happening, you saw, I think, 1.5 million barrels per day going from Iran to China last year. It's not like Iran's getting hard currency for that. China's using their teapot refineries to process this stuff, and they're trading in goods. They're not trading in currency. That way they get to evade SWIFT, and they don't get hit with the same kind of secondary sanctions. So China's getting a 30 to 40% discount on Iranian oil, and Iran is getting mostly Chinese goods. It's not really, this is kind of reinforcing this asymmetry or this vulnerability. So it's not really in meaningful material terms. I think it's really overstated. I think what we're seeing more of is the normative importance of this, and this is something that I think is worth exploring a little more. We see this a lot, especially with the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. I'm kind of a skeptic of both. I think that maybe it's still early days. Maybe we'll see these organizations develop into something more tangible in the future. But I think the expansion, SEO is often described as this China-led organization. I think the expansion in 2017, bringing India and Pakistan, has really diluted China's influence in this organization. I think it's probably less useful for China as an organization in a lot of ways. I think it's very useful for Iran. I mean, anytime you get membership in an organization that includes Russia, China, and India, of course this is useful. The same with BRICS. But I don't know really what this means in terms of how this changes the landscape yet. I think what we can all agree on, and this is where the revisionism part comes in, both Iran and China are dissatisfied actors in certain terms. But even in this, we can't say they're both revisionist and have it mean the same thing. Revisionism is a very imprecise term in how it's often used in international relations. I mean, if you go to the traditional Gilpin tradition of, a country that's got thwarted ambitions resulting in wanting to overturn things, I think that fits largely in how Iran sees the region and maybe the broader world. That the way power is distributed, the organizing principles of regional and international politics, the status quo norms and rules and institutions limit Iran's ambitions. And I think everybody would agree that Iran would like to see this change very much. In China's case, I think of it more as a soft revisionist, and I think it's important to consider this. I mean, when you hear Chinese leaders talk, or hopefully Chinese academics that we'll hear from as well, there's kind of a complicated relationship with order. I think China's benefited tremendously from the international order as it exists, economic growth and development and opportunities to enjoy a pretty stable environment has been very helpful for China. So if you look at it in this very raw Westphalian order, based on traditions like territoriality and non-intervention and sovereignty, I think China says this is the kind of international order that we can get behind. We like this. I think when we take in the kind of liberal international order and we start bringing these liberal norms and preferences that especially Western countries in the Anglosphere and the EU promotes and uses the basis for things like human rights and democracy and things like this, I think that's where China says, yeah, we'd like to maybe check out of the liberal part. We like the order part, not the liberal part. And in this, I think China's got a large group of countries that would agree, right? I think most of the global South is tired of hearing all of us meaning people that look like me, lecture about how you should do things differently and you should do things more like us. But again, I think that normative affinity is really the limit to what we've seen in terms of any kind of organization. I think everybody would agree that there should be a more inclusive set of norms and practices. But I don't think that means that countries are willing to line up behind China or behind Russia or behind one power and say we want to do it like that. What China has shown in the past few years, I realize we're almost out of time, but there has been an expansion. When the BRI was announced, every Chinese official said this isn't meant to challenge the liberal order, or the international order, it's meant to complement it, right? There's a lot of gaps in what the existing institutions can do, and things like the New Development Bank or different BRI initiatives, AIIB, these can support order and make things work a little better for everybody. The past few years, you're seeing alternatives, and they're not meant as support, they're meant, I think, as saying, we have a different idea about how things should work. And when you see the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative and the Global Civilizational Initiative, these are three things China's rolled out since 21. They've been really under-discussed in the past couple of years. I think they're very, very important. The fact that global is the first word in all of them, shows that China sees a more global leadership position for itself and in this shaping norms that drive how things work. And I think in this, Iran sees a change that's very attractive. I imagine leaders in Tehran would like to see a more a set of norms driven by Chinese preferences. It would be more in line with what they would like. But again, I think this just reinforces the asymmetry, because it's not like China's working with Tehran to say, let's shape these. I think this is coming from Beijing, and I think Tehran is saying, we'll get behind this if you want, but it's not like, they're equal partners in this. And I think this is just going to reinforce a lot of these asymmetries and vulnerabilities. And I don't think, I think, as I said, China I see as more of a soft revisionist. Iran, I think, definitely qualifies as a hard revisionist, and where China's interests in the region are really for the status quo, a stable environment where they can trade and do business. If Iran is seeing it as an impediment to that, I think there's a very low ceiling on what we can expect, in terms of Chinese support for Iran. Anyhow, thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation and questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for your perspective on partnerships in revisionism. And our second speaker is Niloufar Baghernia, a PhD candidate in international relations at the Australian National University, where she serves as a tutor at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies. She is also a guest researcher at the Institute for Middle East Strategies Studies in Iran. She will be presenting a paper titled China's Position in Iran's Look East Policy, Neoclassical Realist Perspectives. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this. Before I begin, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the conference organizers. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really excited to share my insights with you all. So the title needs a little bit revision here. And what I'm actually looking and trying to understand, investigate is the origins of Iran's Look East policy using neoclassical realist perspectives in Ebrahim Raisi's presidency. So the question is why Iran has shifted more toward China during Ebrahim Raisi's presidency. This can be challenging. We can discuss this later if you have any questions. But what I argue is the structure, the pressure coming from international system and the Middle East has played a more significant role in the Iran's foreign policy behavior. So I will talk about this in detail in my next slides. But I also argue that in contrast with previous presidents in Iran, it appears that the Raisi administration is highly likely to follow the same behavior toward China, regardless of any reconciliation with the West. And this is mostly because of the internal factors, like the conservatives' role in Iranian's political system, which is why I argue that the regime will follow the same foreign policy, regardless of any reconciliation with the West. So why actually I talk about the systemic factors? The first one is not new, as also scholars talked about this before yesterday. America's hegemonic power has also played in Iran's understanding Iran's foreign policy toward China. And Iran always, the Islamic Republic always blames the United States for being isolated, marginalization of countries like Iran globally and also regionally. And I think it was in latest Ebrahim Raisi's visit in Latin America, he talked about the United States' role in Iran's Look East policy and how it has affected countries who are opposed to the United States' power. And he talked about the military weapons in the past, but now the weapons has changed, and now they use sanctions to affect these countries. So he also asked countries like who oppose this hegemonic power of the United States to cooperate more with each other, which is why that I'm saying that the Islamic Republic thinks that we should cooperate with most like-minded countries like China or Russia to counter the hegemonic power of the United States, as I mentioned, which is not new. But the second one is what I found out is China's rise, which has also affected Iran's Lucas policy. In his latest, not latest, actually in 2021, Xi Jinping, he talked about how the balance of power is changing, and the United States and all the international community should respect this and understand that this is changing, and we also want to be involved in all these challenges, international challenges. So the more China is getting involved in strategically important areas like Middle East, the more Iran is willing to cooperate with China, which also I found when you compare the scholars, I mean, not scholars, officials, speeches, interviews, they talk about this, how China and also Russia or others are important in our foreign policy making decisions. So this can be everyday or rightful resistance, whatever you call it, because there are changes, differences in between China and Iran, how they understand the United States. But what is important is the resistance that two countries also follow this resistance. So I think what is even more important is the regional pressure, which I found out after doing research regarding China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. I realized that Iran's growing threat perception from Saudi Arabia has also affected Iran's Look East policy and focusing on China. And the Look East policy actually has been used as a strategy to reduce this vulnerability coming from the region on Iran. So why I'm saying this, well, scholars talked about this before, I think last year, how this has been changing and how Saudi Arabia has been playing a role in Iran's strategic thinking. But what I found out is the latest developments in the Middle East has also affected Iran's growing threat perception from Saudi Arabia. One of them, the first one, is Saudi Arabia's increasing ties with China. Well, economic relationship aside, also military cooperation with China has been increasing. Well, when you compare the economic relationship with, Saudi Arabia and Iran's economic relationship with China, there is a huge difference. And considering the military relationship, according to the latest news, that China has been helping Saudi Arabia to manufacture ballistic missiles, which also has been changing the understanding of Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the second one is related to the mass protests in Iran. And according to Iranian scholars, Islamic Republic understood how Saudi Arabia played a role in Iran's mass protests, and they made it actually as a condition and demanded Saudi Arabia to stop supporting news channels which give opponents platform. So what was even more important was the China GCC summit in 2022. And in that summit, they talked about how to ensure the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. And also they talked about the territorial dispute between the UAE and Iran, which was really shocking in Iran. And I was really monitoring what is happening in the region. And I realized that Iraqi officials, they went to Iran, and after returning to Iraq, they claim that Iranian officials are really concerned with, sorry, need to read this, that Iran is worried that improved economic ties and also military ties between China and Riyadh could unravel this status quo of Iran and China's relationship, which was really important, I think. And also the last one is normalization with Israel also, I think, has played an important role in Iran's emphasis on Look's policy. Well, this becomes important when you compare Ibrahim Raisi's discussion with Saudi officials when they. But the first thing that Ibrahim Raisi started talking was about normalization with Israel, and it will not bring any peace. As he talked, he said the normalization with Israel will not bring any peace and security to the region, and Israel is not just an enemy to Palestinians, but also to all Muslims, which was, I think, was important considering Iran's focusing on Look's policy. So all of them have played a role in all the understanding of the Islamic Republic, that the balance of power might be changing in favor of Saudi Arabia, and which has made Iran to emphasize more on its Look's policy to China to reduce this vulnerability to the pressure from the region. So the last, okay. Okay, I don't know what, yes. The last slide. Well, I'm not ignoring the domestic factors, but what I argue is that structure has played more important role in Iran's following Look's policy. So the desire to be the regional power and the anti-Americanism, the rejectionist foreign policy, and also the conservatives that are in power now, they have all played role. But what comes, I think, more important is this regional pressure and also the pressure coming from the international system, I think, are more important than the domestic ones. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your PowerPoint presentation, informative one. And our third speaker is Degang Sun. He's a professor of political science at the Institute of International Studies and director of Center for Mideastern Studies in Fudan University in Shanghai. He will be presenting a paper co-authored by Sharvinaz Khan Mohammadi titled The China-Iran 25-Year Strategic Agreement and the Strategic Rebalance of the Gulf. The floor is yours.
Of ACRPS Center. Special thanks go to Your Excellency Maharan for your gracious invitation. This is my first visit to the Middle East since the COVID-19. And today we were talking about Iranian looking east policy. But my question is, when did Iran begin to look east? I think that's a very long time ago. In 1979, when Iran started its Islamic revolution, it says neither east nor west, only Islamic Republic. And if you look at China simultaneously, China was looking east to US, European, and Japan, South Korea, right? So the two sides are back to back, but in the new era, they are face to face. So the watershed is, of course, in 2021, China and Iran signed 25-year strategic agreement. It's very long-term. It's also strategic. So the driving force is, of course, the changing international system. In particular, U.S. pulling out from JCPOA and U.S. policy against China, especially decoupling China, de-risking economic sanctions and embargo against China's high-tech products, etc. So from there, both China and Iran feel disillusioned. They are from back to back to face. So if we look at the 25 years strategic agreement between China and Iran, we can see China's grand strategy. We know China is a developing country. We have two strategies. One is relying on global south, But the second one is not very visible. That is Global East. I believe China has two wings. Global South, yes. Global East, because China is an Asian country. So the purpose for Global East is to build Asian community of shared future. So how can China promote Global East? I think it has many means. The first one is to promote reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Why does China want to promote it? Because, first of all, Iran-Saudi consolidation and reconciliation can promote interconnectivity of infrastructure so that China can promote its BRI. The second reason is China can promote Iran, Saudi, and other GCC countries' strategic autonomy so that they will not rely on Western military arms. They can reduce arms race. The third one is China can encourage the Gulf countries to shift its national strategy to economic development. China's narrative is the problem in the Gulf is not lack of democracy, it's lack of development. So China's principle of values is development first, not democracy first, which is welcomed in this area. So by promoting reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China has cultivated a global East. The second one is China is applying its institutional diplomacy. We know China is a very important member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So far, it has 9 full members. Iran has been the full member since July this year, right? And don't forget, it has 14 partners for dialogue. 7 are from the Middle East. They are Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and Bahrain. 7 are from the Middle East. So China's grand strategy for the Global East is we will invite the Middle East to the big family of Asia. You know, nowadays we say Asia and the Middle East, but Chinese perception of Middle East is West Asia. West Asia is part of Asia. So the purpose is if Turkey can rediscover its Turkic state identity, right? And Turkey has no possibility to enter European Union. Welcome back to Asian community. And also Iran is looking east. GCC countries are looking east for economic and political opportunities and partnerships. Therefore, if we put all of them together, and also don't forget Russia. Russia is pivoting to Asia as well after Russia-Ukraine crisis. So China's Global East perception is based on the changed international situation. Global East is geographical, political, and cultural concept. It does not necessarily mean Global East and Global West are 2 blocks. It's not the truth. In fact, Global Eastern countries cannot go without Global West economic and institutional perspectives. However, they do have different divergent values. Global West is based on Christian world, and the core values are individualism, freedom, democracy, and human rights. They are developed economies. While Global East are very diverse in culture, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Orthodox, and Confucius cultures. So Global Eastern countries are mostly civilization states. They play emphasis more on development. So the major enemy is not Global West. The major enemy is the underdevelopment inside. So underdevelopment is the core problem of all the countries for their modernizations. So in the past 300 years, the Global Eastern countries are learning from the West. But nowadays, we know Global West represents only 40% of the world GDP and 1/4 of the world population. In the future, the world gravity of economic influence is shifting from the Atlantic to Global East, I believe. So in that situation, China would like to rely on Global East rise to develop its economy and influence. So in that situation, we can find, in fact, the Global East countries are integrating with each other. Economically, we know nowadays Global Eastern countries' major economic partners are not Global West, but themselves. For example, China is the largest trading partner of almost all Asian countries, right? The second one is technological advancement, and in the fourth wave of globalizations, right? India, China, Vietnam, even Central Asian countries and the Gulf countries are the core of globalization. Therefore, we can find the global eastern countries which were blocked by high mountains, Gobi deserts, or rivers now are interconnecting with each other by highways, super railways, etc. So the rise of land power inside Asian countries has developed Global East. The third one is identity politics. We see nowadays Japan, Russia, Israel, Turkey, Iran, and GCC countries are rediscovering their historical memories. Turkey has renamed Turkey, right? India is considering changing its name. The signal is they are rediscovering their cultural and civilization identities. So it can promote the imagined community of Asia. And the last one is these countries in Asia are a grouping of dissatisfaction for different purposes. So in that situation, we can see a Global East is looming. It's not against the West, but they have a new option to build a balanced world. So in that situation, we can say Global East is one bed, many dreams, because different countries have their different agendas, right? But they have their also problems. That is, when we are rebuilding ourselves as a global Eastern country, it may cause unexpected consequences of institutional rivalry. And we know China is relying on Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, and AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Russia is relying on Collective Security Treaty Organization. US is relying on Indo-Pacific Quad of US, Japan, India, and Australia, and the Western Asia Quad of US, India, UAE, Israel. Turkey is relying on Organization of Turkic States, right? One nation, 6 countries, right? Iran is relying on Economic Cooperation Organization. Saudi Arabia is relying on Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So in that situation, in the future, in the Global East, the competition will be among different institutions. The different institutions will dilute each other, which may cause oversupply or surplus of institutions. So in the future, I believe all countries in Global East and beyond should transcend this kind of fierce competition to build an Asian community of shared future. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your take on the Global East, Global West debatable perspective. Our last but not least speaker is Jianwei Han is an associate professor and director of the Iranian Studies program at the Middle East Studies Institute and Shanghai International Relations Studies University. She has published more than 20 journal articles and a book titled The Economic Modernization of Islamic Republic of Iran. Her paper is titled China's Cognition and Response to Iran's Look East Policy, an Explanation of Partner Community Framework. Floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful to Eric and Professor Baghernia to invite me to attend this outstanding conference. And today I want to talk about China's cognition and response to Iran's Look East policy, explanation of partner community framework. Sorry. I want to. Okay. Thank you. In recent years, the regional order in the Middle East is undergoing a profound transformation. An important manifestation of this is the eastward shift in the foreign policies of Middle Eastern countries, especially the middle powers of the Middle East, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, are seeking to establish a closer strategic partnership with China and other Asian countries. Among these countries, Iran has a more prominent look-east policy and is more active to develop relations with China, India, and Central Asian countries. So, the significant transformation of Iran's foreign policy to look east mainly occurred in 2018 after Trump administration withdrew from JCPOA and launched extreme sanctions against Iran. And China is playing a critical role in pulling Iran's foreign policy more eastward looking. So my question is, how to define the relationship of China and Iran? Is it an alliance? I argue that the alliance theory cannot explain the close relationship between China and Iran. It is more appropriate to understand the relationship from the China's perspective. So partner community is the primary logic and concept of China's diplomacy. So China's cognition and response to Iran's look-east policy is based on the partner community philosophy and serves the common interests of China and Iran. So how to, I think the alliance theory cannot explain the relations of China and Iran. And we know alliance theory has a strong influence on Western international relations theory. And the general view is that alliance is a military and security bloc formed in response to external threats with formal covenants and mutual offensive and defensive assistance agreements, which is not only in contrast to multilateral organizations that do not emphasize military functions, but to international organizations that are committed to collective security. And however, there are many different types of alliance in reality. Now many countries tend to give up the traditional way of alliance to achieve diplomatic goals and adopt a fluid, a weak, and reasonable way to form a temporary alliance or quasi-alliance. Although the forms of alliance have become more diverse, but the reasons for an alliance are broadly similar. The reason for an alliance is mainly because of the existence of an enemy, and a country needs to ally with one or more countries to counter the threat of the enemy jointly. So the impact of alliance theory on Western countries is profound. So far, the U.S. remains the world's best at adopting alliance theory. However, the U.S. adherence to the alliance strategy doesn't mean that alliance confrontation is still the dominant form of the international relations. Now, the main rivals of U.S., such as Iran, China, and Russia, have yet to form such an alliance in the way that the U.S. does. The three countries indeed need to form an alliance to balance the U.S., but the reality is China firmly pursued a policy of non-alignment, and Iran claims its policy is neighborhood and balanced. And especially after the outbreak of the Ukraine war, Russia remained alone against Ukraine and the West as a whole. So we can say Iran's look-east policy has elicited a positive response from China. And now China and Iran enjoy a relationship that is better than an ally. So China has not only maintained a close relationship with Iran, but also facilitated the Iran-Saudi dialogue, breaking the logic of the allies theory that the enemy of a friend is the enemy, and evolving into the logic of that the enemy of a friend can be a friend. So how to understand China's philosophy, the philosophy of China's diplomacy? And I want to talk about the partner community theory. Partner community diplomacy, that is the integration of partner diplomacy and community diplomacy, and is a general description of the philosophy of China's foreign policy. So I think China's diplomacy is a framework based on partnership and aimed to and building a community. And building partnership is the principal means which pursues to building a community order in the end. So the features of the partnerships in China's diplomacy are as follows. One, openness. The partner can be established with all countries without being exclusive or forming a closed bloc against any other country. Two, inclusive. The partnership doesn't emphasize differences in political systems and ideologies, but joint development and strengthening cooperation. And third, flexibility. Partnerships can be established at different levels on the basis of respecting each other's intentions. The fourth, equality. The status of China and its partners is entirely equal. The fifth, independence. China respects the complete independence of its partners in domestic and foreign affairs, and promises to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So community is mainly a diplomatic idea developed by President Xi that is building a community with a shared future for mankind is the primary goal of China's diplomacy. So the idea of community with a shared future has its characteristic values. So the main idea of a community means the world is interdependent and interconnected, and believes that countries can achieve peaceful coexistence and joint development through cooperation. And the different countries should work together to deal with the common global problems, and rich countries should take more responsibilities. So the idea of a community with a shared future sounds ideal, but has its practical basis driven by common interests. So it is especially desirable to those developing countries with urgent demand for peace, stability, and development, and hope to enhance their status in the international landscape. So partner diplomacy and community diplomacy are highly interrelated. So generally, China first established a partnership with a country. When the bilateral relationship develops to a certain degree, it will elevate to a level of building a community on the presence of both sides, the will of both sides. So China is also trying to encourage other countries to approve the concept of partner community diplomacy, so these countries can form partners with each other based on equality and mutual trust without targeting others, and gradually form the consciousness of community order.
5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. The idea of partner community is not a fancy of idealism, but fully considers China's practical interest. But I should point out that China's way of thinking about its interest is a kind of share thinking, a share. So we can say the China-Iran relationship has proved that the comprehensive strategic partnership has not endangered the regional security situation, but promoted the easing of the situation in the region and provided some help for Middle Eastern countries to get out of the security dilemma. So how China responds to Iran's Look East policy. First, China believes that Iran Look East policy is a result of long-term sanctions and unfair treatment by the U.S., and also inspired by China's policy of regarding Iran as an equal partner. And especially the 2018 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Qingdao Summit has proved to be a significant support for Iran at a critical moment, and it a powerful incentive for Iran to look east. Second, China believes that Iran Look East policy is conducive to constructing a new neighborhood order guided by the idea of community. So now Middle East has been China's extended neighbors, and China hoped the Middle East region can form such a community order. So Iran's Look East policy aligns with China's strategy of navigating the Middle East as a whole. Third, China hopes that Iran, with its Look East policy, can become a responsible power and contribute to the realization of regional peace, especially on the nuclear issue. China acknowledges it supports Iran's legitimate right to use nuclear energy for peaceful purpose, while urging Iran to maintain cooperation with IAEA and not to seek nuclear weapons and withdraw from the NPT. And fourth, China eventually brokered a rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, bringing the two rivals into its partner community framework. So my concurrent and partner community diplomacy is not an idealistic illusion, nor is it a narrative crafted by China to disguise its purpose and a rising power seeking hegemony. The philosophy of Chinese diplomacy is strong but not hegemonic, and peaceful rise is the principal cognition of China's non-alignment diplomatic. So for Iran has been sanctioned by U.S. for a long time and faces the overall pressure of the West, while China's long-term support and respect promotes Iran to continue to look east. Thank you very much. This is my speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Han, for this presentation. We've listened to very different views on the partnership of Iran and China, and a lot of food for thought. So now we open the floor for the questions. Okay, so we go first. Then we'll take one from here, and then we continue. So go first, please. Please introduce yourself. Very concise question, please.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Abdurrasul Salar. I just wanted to have a very quick question about the security and defense aspect of Chinese cooperation with Iran, but broader in the Middle East, if it's possible, from the Chinese speakers. China's rational when it comes to defense and security partnership, for example, cooperation with Saudi Arabia, Emirates, on various defense issues, or with Iran on maritime security things. So how this is very much seen by China? Is it really Chinese policy to balance United States in the region, because or somehow substitute U.S. presence in the military terms, or how you define the general policy there? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting panel. My name is Kazem Sajjadpour. I have one comment and one question. The comment is, it seems that the panel is depicting two narratives of Iranian-Chinese relationship. One, which was offered by the first distinguished speaker, is to downgrading this relationship in terms of economic, especially in comparative, let's say, setting. However, the second one is a more qualitative outlook toward this relationship that's a shaping factor of the regional as well as a global, let's say, situation. I think the reality may not be just on the quantification, but on the quality, because it's a qualitative relationship. But the question that I have is, to what extent U.S.-Chinese relationship affects this relationship? We know that Chinese-U.S. relationship is a very complex, very dynamic, and of course a tense relationship, but however it is very over-independence of two countries to each other. How this impacts Chinese policy toward Iran, and where are the debates in China on this issue? This is the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady over there. We'll take a first round of 5 questions, and then if you have time, we'll go back.
Good morning. My name is C. We all know that China is facing a challenge this year as it's weakening economic recovery from post-COVID-19. We all know that as for today, the Chinese GDP is accumulated to less than 4%, compared to its predicted to 5 to 6% from the famous firms like McKinsey and Bloomberg. But even 1 to 2% of Chinese GDP can be a big deal, because this country has spent almost 40% of the GDP each year in its international investment. So especially created a big fear globally to almost all these trading partners in the Middle East as well.
Question, please.
So my question is, regarding this weakening economic of China, what do you think is China's plan to maintain its relationship with the countries like Iran as its biggest trading partner, and also the rest of the world? And also, as we know that UAE and China is to have this joint Air Force training in Xinjiang, do you think this move will affect this relationship with Iran as well? Thank you.
This side, gentleman here.
Thank you very much for this inspiring panel. I am Vefa, a PhD student from Qatar University Gulf Studies. I have a question to Ms. Niloufar and Dr. Degang Sun, related to Israel and China relations and the normalization period have affected Iran's policy to China. Ms. Niloufar just mentioned that Iran, after this normalization period, Iran towards into the Chinese policy. It affected, I understand that. And Degang Sun also mentioned that the global East policy of the China is also include Israel. In here, I just little bit confused how it will be possible, how it's the China-Israel relations and the normalization period will affect the Iran-China relations. Thank you very much.
5th question here.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for the panelists, but especially for Professor Fulton. You have described both China and Iran as revisionist players. So my question is, in your view, is there still a chance for us to see a new Iran nuclear deal? And if there is one, is it going to affect the relations between China and Iran? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll start with Dr. Degang Sun. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have three questions. The first one is from Mr. Abdullah Rasool about China, Iran, and China GCC security and military cooperation. According to the data of Stockholm Peace Institute, China's arms sales to the Middle East is very minimal, about 5%, very minimal. Then you raised the question about China-US rivalry in the Middle East, especially in arms sale. In fact, China has not been in a good position to compete with USA, which maybe represents 25% of the arms sales, right, in the Middle East. So why does China sales maybe drones or other military facilities? The reason is very clear from the target countries, especially Iran and GCC countries. They have the demand. If they cannot get arms from China, they will rely on the European Union or Russia or USA. So China is reluctantly selling something, right? But it's not very substantial so far. The second question about China's slow economy and its impact on the Middle East. Yes, China's economy is very weak this year, but if we look at global picture down, right, so that's a global issue. For China, we have a slogan of transformation from high-speed economy to high-quality economy. Of factories with such as steel factories, which may cause heavy air pollution. So the high-quality economic growth means that China's economic growth rate will be impact on to the Middle East is China's investment may be reduced in the foreseeable future, right? And the third one is about China-Israel and China-Iran relations, especially the global Asia. I think impossible is nothing in the 21st century. Several years ago, can you imagine that China can mediate and promote reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia? It happens, right? So in the future, we as scholars, we should use our imagination. Impossible is nothing. Can we imagine maybe in the future, Iran and Israel can reach diplomatic reconciliation, right? So China's idea of community of shared future is we should think more broadly. We should stand not on our nationalism or populism. If in that situation, I think we can create something which is impossible in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Niloufar. You have one or two questions, if you want.
One question, or if maybe I didn't understand the first one, but the second one about the normalization of Arab-Israeli relations, I think it is really important because the way Iran sees it, the normalization can make Iran even more isolated. So this isolation makes Iran believe that, this normalization makes Iran believe that this can change the balance of power against Iran, which also affects definitely the strategic thinking of Iran, I think, in considering its relations and its status in the Middle East. The first one, I didn't catch it well, maybe how China affects the relationship. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but well, I have plans to study this, and it will be one of my chapters in my thesis. So I cannot answer this question because it in more research. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fulton.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think your question about the U.S., China, Iran triangle, I think the U.S. is a very important angle in that. And you can see, just looking at the period of the JCPOA, the narrative in the U.S. is that China wasn't deeply involved. There was a really great chapter that was written at a conference, or from a conference here a couple of years ago in a book called The Red Star and the Crescent. And John Garver, who wrote kind of the Bible on China relations, contributed to this chapter where he showed the number of high-level meetings between Chinese and Iranian officials in the 16 months or so leading up to the JCPOA, which indicated that China actually played a pretty big big role behind the scenes. I don't think it's a coincidence that Xi Jinping visited Tehran shortly after. You know, he was in Tehran in January 2016. I think he's the first head of state to visit Iran after the JCPOA, and that's when the first announcement of this comprehensive strategic partnership agreement was made public. And it seemed to be kind of a reward, I thought. China saying, look, you need investment, you need infrastructure, you need trade, and we're willing to do all this stuff with you. Didn't see it happen. And the reason I think, I wrote a paper about this in Middle East policy last year, I don't think it's a coincidence that a few months later when Donald Trump was campaigning for president, his foreign policy was pretty much limited to, you know, China's eating our lunch and the Iran deal is the worst deal in history. So when China and Iran see this, I think you could see, well, look, China backed away pretty quickly from a lot of the commitments, or not commitments, but things that they were talking about doing with Iran. You saw trade not develop very quickly. You saw these investment projects disappear pretty quickly. And I think, I don't have any evidence of this, but I think in Beijing they looked at it and said, the U.S. can affect our economy in both positive and negative ways very deeply, and Iran simply can't. We have more to win or lose by having a good relationship with Washington than we do if we have a good relationship with Tehran. And again, China's relations with the Saudis, with the Emiratis is quite mature. They have the same kind of agreement, the comprehensive strategic partnership with both of them as well. They get most of what they need from the Gulf from that side of the Gulf. So Iran, I think they looked at it and said, we can kind of step back until the pressure on us eases off a bit. I also don't think it's a coincidence that you saw China operationalize this partnership shortly after the trade war between China and the U.S. when you know the U.S. weaponized trade against China. After the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA unilaterally, which then resulted in a very aggressive regional policy from Iran. We saw the attacks in Fujairah, the attack on Saudi Aramco. These things deeply threatened China's interests in the region. And then you saw the assassination of Soleimani. I don't think China had this moment where they said, you know what, we really